Okay, this is the last video for AP Psych, and we're going to start out with conformity. We are influenced by society when we conform to group norms. This is not uniformity, which is created by choice, not social pressure. Conformity is created by social pressure, like ostracism, frowns, and of course the impact of the group, which leads us to Solomon Asch, and you'll recall that we studied his experiment in detail. The idea of a group of people answering something incorrectly, and then one person who is part of the group but doesn't know the others are working with the experimenter will be tested to see if that person will fall for or become conforming to the group and its incorrect answer. We also did this study with the freshmen, as you recall, early in the year. The nature of the task can have an influence on how much conformity takes place. The more ambiguous the task, the more conformity. There seems to be an increase in conformity if a culture is more collectivist versus independent. But conformity seems to be universal, with slight variances depending on the type of culture. All right, moving on, let's take a look at compliance. This is a change in behavior related to a specific request, and we want to mention specifically something called the foot in the door effect. And that's the idea that once a small request has been granted, people are more likely to comply with a larger request. We saw this in persuasion, and the idea of that was put forward by the researcher who was talking about how sales work and how advertising and persuasion works, finding out that if you can get a person to make a small step in a particular direction, like wearing a button that says something, then they're much more likely to put a giant sign in their yard, or if they buy a little thing first, then they're much more likely to buy a larger thing later. So this is the idea of how we tend to comply with other people's requests. There's another term here we want to look at called the lowballing procedure, and in some ways this is the opposite of the foot in the door effect. You see this a lot with car sales. This is the idea that when people are being sold a car, they will negotiate, and the people selling it to them will come up with a price, and eventually they'll firm up what the price is, and then after that the car salesperson will add more things to it, because once they agree, then as they're much less likely to say no if they've already decided that that new car is theirs. So car salespeople start low, and then once the person agrees, they add things on, like a lower trade rate or some sort of protection for the carpet and the floorboard or something like that, road hazard or some other type of add-on. And because people have already said yes, they're going to allow them to do things that if they put in the original price, they probably would not have done that. Finally, the last one is something called the door-in-the-face effect. If a person says no to one thing, they're more likely to comply with a second request. This actually connects to the discussion we've had throughout the year about anchoring, and how you could, if you chose perhaps to get a later curfew or something like that. The idea being that if the parents say no, 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 eventually they're going to say yes, and so you'll start with your demands being rather outrageous, and then you can still get something you want, but you do this by manipulating people with what's called the door-in-the-face effect. In other words, the idea is if a salesman comes to the door and you slam the door in their face, then if they knock again, you're going to feel a little more guilty, or if you run into them again, you're more likely to say yes the second time. Next term, of course, is obedience, and that's Milgram's shock experiment, which we discussed quite a bit. The things that influence whether you're obedient or not include the amount of power that you personally vest in the person giving the orders. Surveillance. If you're not watched, you're less likely to obey, especially if the order is unethical. Who is nearby? Are your peers there? If responsibility can be shared, obedience is actually greater. In Milgram's Holocaust experiment, people obeyed because they saw themselves merely as the agent of order rather than actors, or in other words, the people running it. So the view was that the experimenter would have to take all the grief if somebody was hurt, not they themselves, because they were just following an order that was given by somebody in authority. Again, taking away your sense of a connection or buy-in to something makes you less likely to feel like you're part of it, and thus look at things very differently. And also, for some reason, a lot of the people in that experiment didn't see what was going on as evil, and don't understand the morality of the situation, again, because they see themselves as detached. Okay, the next category, social action. These are processes that occur when people interact either one-on-one or in groups, and they include de-individuation, helping behavior, group decision-making, organizational behavior, just to name a few. So let's take de-individuation first. This is what happens when people feel anonymous. Its most striking example is during mob behavior, which we've actually seen on television recently and is very well known throughout the world. And the reason that people act so differently when they're in a mob or a group is something that's kind of interesting, because if you ask people that did something in mob behavior why they did it later, and you ask them one-on-one, they have a hard time explaining it. But the real reason is that they felt anonymous, and so if you feel anonymous, you can get away with things, and thus you don't feel like an individual, or de-individuation. Mobs often show something called the snowball effect. That means a leader or persuader persuades a few people to do something, then the few become many, and snowballs into an unthinking mob. Another reason for de-individuation is protection. It's because there's a lot of people, it's hard for the authorities to come after any one person, and so, in other words, if you can hide with the group. There is an alternative side, however, as research shows that group influences can prompt good behavior as well, such as helping behavior. Why do people help strangers? Altruistic behavior is not related to the benefits that you get. The presence of other people is probably the most important situational variable here. It's called the bystander effect. As the number of people increases, the likelihood that you are passive and don't do anything becomes greater. So, and the likelihood of you intervening decreases. This is called the bystander effect. So the more people there are, the less likelihood you're going to get involved in something. Now, for different reasons. Number one, again, you are anonymous. Number two, a lot of times when you come across something, there's a lot of ambiguity as to exactly what happened. The less understandable a situation, the less likely you are to intervene. And thus you have a decreased sense of personal responsibility. The key here to get people to be involved is to get them to feel some sense of responsibility. Phil has I think we watched this in one of the classes, or maybe all. There was an experiment done on a beach not far from New York City, where a person was laying on the beach and got up and left her stuff and her radio sitting there, walked away, and then they had somebody else that was part of the experiment come up and try and act as though they were stealing it and run off with it. People around them, or people around this girl who had left, saw the radio being stolen but didn't do anything about it for varying reasons. But the main one is they didn't feel a sense of personal attachment. In a second condition, the experimenter set up a situation where the girl, before leaving her stuff sitting there, went to a neighbor and asked, "Would you watch my stuff?" And in every case, when the other person involved in the experiment would come and try and steal the radio, the person who was asked to watch it would get up and go after them. So the difference here is the connection with the idea of personal responsibility. And beyond personal responsibility, the amount of empathy that you feel for someone, including similarity, will affect the likelihood that you intervene. The more you feel a connection to that person, the more likely you are to intervene. If you feel like that they're very different from you and that you don't really have an understanding of them, you're less likely to be part of it. What of culture and its influence on this type of behavior? It's doubtful that there is such a thing as a helpful culture. There are some effects of individualism versus collectivism. It's mixed with no specific connection either way as to whether one culture would be more helpful than another. The next issue that we see here is group decision making. Point one, and we'll go back, this includes organizations, businesses, juries, etc. And we did this in great detail as we looked at groupthink. One point is the idea of group polarization. We assume that a group is less likely to make risky choices than an individual might. But in truth, the opposite is actually true. This is something called risky shift. Risky shift is just one aspect of polarization. That's the tendency of individuals to become more extreme in their attitudes as a result of being part of a group. Why does this happen? People discover others hold their own view, or the view they do, then one or more push this view more than they would normally in an effort to be seen as in the most positive light possible, or as the most supportive of the group. So it's sort of we don't want to use the term snowball effect because that's a little bit different, but it's basically that idea that as a group begins to talk about things, the individuals will sort of lose their own handle on things, and in attempting to show that they are part of the group and a good member of the group, they'll push a lot of these ideas even further, and everybody seems to join in. Next question: are groups better than individuals in making decisions? This is true only under specific circumstances. Some of the problems, stuff like social loafing, and this is the idea that you've run into perhaps in group activities at Ursuline, and that is occasionally there's people in a larger group who don't do anything, believing that the other people will do it, and of course that does happen. The cohesiveness of being in a group can actually be a benefit when it comes to looking at things. You'll probably have better morale, etc. But you can end up with groupthink, which of course we looked at in great detail. Okay, we're going to skip over a little bit about the leadership information, although leadership styles we did actually see in the experiment dealing with democracy versus fascism that was done just as World War II was cranking up. And you recall that the group that was led in a sort of a fascist way did a lot of work, but only when the boss was around and was much less creative. The group that was led by in a manner that could probably be called a little bit of anarchy really didn't get anything done, and the group that seemed to have the most success and get the most creative and dedicated work was the one that was led through a democratic form of authority, meaning that people had buy-in. And again, that's the key. If you can get people to buy into things, either you or others, their behavior is probably always going to be better. A little bit more, let's take a look at the Hawthorne effect. That's pretty important stuff. This is the term for the idea that people in a psych experiment know that they're in a psych experiment. And so the behavior changes merely due to the fact that they know that they're in an experiment. And our final point, one that you can take with you as you head off to college or whatever you're going to be doing next year, and that is that if individuals believe that they have input into a decision, they are more satisfied with their own workplace, and they actually will probably be better workers. So that ends our quick look at some of the details of social psych. I would suggest that you take a look at all the good stuff that we have in content for review, and I hope you do well on the AP exam.